I used to believe in anniversaries. I'd mark the dates in gold ink, plan surprises, and decorate the dining table like a page from a glossy magazine. But on our 7th anniversary, instead of candles and laughter, I heard him whisper into his phone, "She's just a shield for you." I froze by the kitchen doorway, the cake knife still in my hand. He laughed again and said, "No, she suspects nothing. She still thinks I love her." I didn't drop the knife. I didn't barge in. I quietly placed it down and walked into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The sound of the shower masked my gasp. That was the moment something inside me shattered. Not from heartbreak, but from clarity. I had just been used, and something new began to stir. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't cry. I served the cake with steady hands, smiled at his jokes, and even posed for our annual selfie. But behind my calm eyes, the woman he thought he knew was already gone. While he laughed and checked his phone, I was memorizing every detail, his habits, his tells, his lies. I slept beside him that night like a stranger in my own bed, staring at the ceiling, numb. The next morning, I woke up early and called a lawyer, someone discreet. "I need advice," I said, voice steady. "Not a divorce yet, just options." My voice didn't tremble. I didn't need tears anymore. I needed strategy. He thought I was soft, naive. He had no idea I was learning how to burn silently. Every day after that became a performance. I kissed him goodbye, packed his lunch, and went to yoga. Only I wasn't going to yoga. I was going to therapy, meeting with accountants, and learning exactly how much our assets were worth. I found a private investigator who handed me photos of him and her. Too many photos. In some, she wore jewelry I had picked out. In others, they laughed in restaurants I had once begged to visit. It hurt, but in a surgical way, like cutting out rot before it spread. I began tracking bank statements and tracing fraudulent expenses. The man who claimed to love me had built an entire web of deceit, and I wasn't going to run from it. I was going to bury him under it. I didn't recognize myself in the mirror, and that was a good thing. The old me had been too soft, too forgiving. This version? She dressed in sharp lines, kept her voice cool, and never let him see her flinch. He'd ask, "Is everything okay?" I'd smile and say, "Perfect." That was my weapon, his belief that I was still blind. But I was wide awake. One evening, I returned home to find his mistress in our kitchen, laughing like she belonged there. He introduced her as a colleague caught in the rain. I offered her tea. I looked her in the eye and said, "Any friend of his is interesting." She flinched. Good. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Soon, they'll both understand. I'm not the victim in this story. I'm the ending." He started getting sloppy. Maybe it was the guilt, or maybe he truly believed I'd never leave. I found receipts for hotels, transfers to fake accounts, and even a shared lease under a false name. He'd built a second life and used me to fund it. But instead of confronting him, I baked his favorite lasagna and watched him eat it like nothing had changed. I kept receipts. I kept smiling. Meanwhile, I met with a corporate attorney, a friend from college who owed me a favor. "You have enough to dismantle him," she said, reviewing the files. "But do you want revenge or freedom?" I answered without pause. Both. I wasn't just planning an exit. I was planning a masterpiece, the kind of departure he'd feel every day for the rest of his life. I transformed quietly. While he was busy lying, I was building. I joined a women's business collective, started sketching again, my old passion, and pitched a line of luxury interior design pieces. It started as therapy. It became a brand. By the time I soft-launched the collection, I already had interest from 2 boutique hotels. My lawyer set up a separate LLC under my name, completely independent from him. He had no idea. At night, he'd come home tired, drained, and kiss my forehead while I was drafting supply chain agreements. He thought I was still his safe harbor, but I had turned into a storm quiet, calculated, and ready. Every insult he once threw, "You're not business-minded, you're just emotional," became fuel. I didn't argue anymore. I didn't need to. I was building the empire that would outlive his legacy. He had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated me. He thought I was too dependent, too soft. He believed the version of me he had sculpted, pliable, forgiving, scared to be alone. But that woman had died the night he told someone else I was a shield. This new woman? She wore confidence like armor. My therapist called it transformation. I called it rebirth. Every time he smiled at me, thinking I was still his, I smiled back and imagined the press release I was drafting with my legal team. He would be publicly exposed, financial fraud, moral bankruptcy, and all. I was giving him the chance to drown in his own arrogance before I tore the ground out from beneath him. And the best part? He still brought me flowers every Friday. Fool. 6 months into my secret rebuild, he surprised me with a weekend getaway. Just us, he said, like he was doing me a favor. I packed a suitcase and went, already knowing it'd be the last time I ever played along. At the resort, while he showered, I scrolled through the final draft of the legal documents on my phone. Divorce, asset division, fraud exposure. Everything was ready. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. That night we sat by the fireplace, and he whispered, "I know I've been distant. I want to fix us." I nodded. Me too. I lied. But as I leaned into his embrace, I knew that would be the last time I ever let him touch me. Because once we got home, he would lose everything, and I would finally be free. Back in the city, the countdown began. I scheduled the press drop, served him papers the same morning, and made sure every news outlet got a copy of the financial misconduct report. Within hours, his world imploded. His phone rang endlessly. His office called, confused. His face turned gray. "What is this?" he asked, holding the papers. I didn't answer. I didn't owe him that. I walked past him, heels echoing like gunshots on our marble floor, and said only this: "You used me to build your empire. Now I'm the one tearing it down." That night, I moved out. My new apartment was small, but full of light. I watched the headlines from my balcony, sipping champagne. The mistress was gone. His lawyers scrambled. And me? I slept like I hadn't in years. He tried to reach me, of course, first with calls, then with emails, and finally through mutual friends. "He's devastated. They said he didn't think you'd actually do it." I smiled. That was the problem. He never thought I could. But I wasn't the same woman he married. I didn't break. I rebuilt. The podcast appearance I recorded went viral. My story struck a nerve with women everywhere. Messages flooded in. "Thank you for telling the truth. You gave me courage." I wasn't just free. I was becoming a symbol. And while he wallowed in scandal, I stood on a TEDx stage, sharing how betrayal became my blueprint. I wasn't ashamed of my past anymore. I was proud of my evolution, because the best revenge isn't destruction. It's transformation. And I was just getting started. He filed a counterclaim, of course. Claimed I was unstable, vindictive, even mentally unfit. His lawyers painted me as the bitter wife. But I had receipts. Every fake transaction, every shared hotel room, every dollar he funneled away. My legal team was surgical. "You don't need to yell," my attorney told me once. "You've already won." He showed up at court with a trembling jaw and no mistress in sight. I walked in with posture that didn't bend. He tried to speak to me during recess. "We can still fix this, Lena." But I just looked at him and said, "You had your chance when I was still breakable." The court sided with me. He lost half his assets and his company's board seat. What he feared most had already happened. I didn't need him. I didn't just win in court. I won in reputation. Every influencer I had collaborated with reposted my story. One of my interior design pieces got featured on a top lifestyle blog, and demand exploded overnight. My brand, Ash and Ember, went from therapy project to trending enterprise. I expanded into consulting, started mentoring other women exiting toxic relationships, and even launched a podcast titled Burn Beautiful. People no longer asked about my ex, they asked about me. The same woman who once stood in the kitchen, shaking with betrayal, was now the face of resilience. The irony? He had once mocked my creativity. "Your art is cute," he'd said, "but it's not real work." Now, he watched as I got invited to panel talks and magazine covers. I didn't block him. Let him see every single glow-up. Months later, I saw her again, his mistress, this time at a charity gala. She wasn't on his arm. She stood in the corner alone, thin-lipped and anxious. I didn't avoid her. I walked up and smiled, not out of pettiness, but because I had no fear left. "You look well," I said, and she flinched like I'd slapped her. "I didn't know," she muttered. "He said you were cold, controlling." I tilted my head and replied, "And you believed him?" She looked down. "He used me too," she said quietly. I believed her, not because I forgave her, but because I understood how smooth he could be. "Well," I said, "I hope you find your fire." Then I turned and walked away. Not victorious. Whole. There's a difference. And I'd finally learned it. The night of the gala, I drove home alone with music loud and windows down. I didn't cry. I didn't feel empty. I felt clear. It's strange how grief can be the thing that gives you back your voice. I thought about that young girl who once clung to a man's love like it was oxygen. I would have given her a hug, told her she was never unlovable, just unappreciated. Now I had a new love story, with myself, my purpose, my peace. That night, I wrote a letter I never sent. "Thank you," it began, "for breaking me so completely. I had no choice but to rebuild." I sealed it, placed it in my journal, and lit a candle. The kind of ceremony, not for mourning, but for rebirth. I was no longer his anything. Business boomed. My inbox overflowed. One morning, a major home retailer contacted me. They wanted to license my designs for a nationwide line. I called my mother, and for the first time in years we cried together, not from pain, but pride. She'd once begged me to leave him. "You're shrinking," she had said. "This marriage is making you smaller." She was right. But back then, I wasn't ready. Now, I was the woman she always knew I could become. We celebrated over dinner, just the two of us. No fancy restaurant, just takeout and wine, feet curled up on the couch. I looked around at my small, cozy apartment and realized I had built this happiness brick by brick. My ex had luxury, but I had peace. And between the two, I had finally chosen well. He still tried to re-enter my life. "We made memories," he said in a voice message one night. "Doesn't that count for something?" I didn't reply. Memories don't justify betrayal. He had chosen his pleasure over my dignity, and now he had to live with that. My silence wasn't bitterness. It was closure. Every time he tried to call, I played music louder. Every time he sent flowers, I handed them to my neighbors. The man who once saw me as disposable now begged for the version of me he destroyed. But she was gone. The woman standing now. She wouldn't even recognize the one who tolerated crumbs in exchange for affection. I didn't seek revenge anymore. I didn't need to destroy him. His loss was punishment enough. And my life, flourishing, was the proof. I met someone new. Slowly, gently. He wasn't loud with affection, but consistent with presence. We met at a bookstore. He recommended a memoir I'd already read, and we laughed. No grand gestures, just coffees, quiet walks, unhurried conversations. He never asked about my past, but when I told him, he didn't flinch. "I don't need to fix you," he said. "You already did that." That was the night I cried, not from pain, but from being seen without conditions. This love was different. It didn't demand I shrink, explain, or prove. It just was. And while I still carried scars, I wasn't ashamed of them. They were reminders that I had survived, and chosen differently this time. For the first time in years, I didn't brace for heartbreak. I leaned in, soft but strong. The funny thing about starting over is how ordinary it feels. I wasn't chasing milestones anymore. I found joy in Sunday groceries, early morning journaling, soft music while I worked. Peace isn't loud, it's steady. My days filled with creativity, with laughter, with women who supported one another, not competed. I didn't wake up with dread anymore. I woke up excited. To paint, to design, to live. I kept the court papers locked in a drawer, not as a reminder of what I lost, but of what I took back. My freedom wasn't handed to me. I earned it. And every quiet moment of joy was a small rebellion against the woman I used to be. I no longer wanted the life he promised. I had something better, a life I built, and one I could trust. The first time I saw him again in public, he looked older, not just physically, but spiritually, like life had wrung him out. He approached me at a design expo where my work was on display. His eyes scanned the crowd before settling on me. "You've changed," he said, almost like an accusation. I smiled. I healed. He reached for something to say, but came up empty. Silence stretched between us like a chasm neither of us could cross anymore. That used to scare me. Now I welcomed it. I didn't ask about his job, his life, or his loneliness. I didn't owe him curiosity. I had people to meet, contracts to finalize. "Take care," I said, and turned back toward the stage. I never looked over my shoulder again. Not once. I began mentoring a group of young women who reminded me of my old self, hopeful, yet doubting their worth. One of them, Sasha, cried during our second session. "He said I was too emotional," she said, "that I ruined everything." I took her hand and whispered, "Then let's build you something no one can ruin." And we did. Slowly, brick by brick. Watching these women rise became a mission. It healed something in me, because I wasn't just teaching them. I was reminding myself how far I'd come. We weren't victims. We were architects, designers of new lives. For every woman who had been belittled, betrayed, or broken, this space became a sanctuary. And in lifting them, I lifted myself. Not every scar needs to be hidden. Some become your foundation. My podcast, Burn Beautiful, reached 1 million downloads. One episode, titled "When Love Isn't Love," went viral. I received letters from women in India, Brazil, and small towns in the Midwest, each saying the same thing: "You helped me leave." I read every message. I cried over most of them, because I knew what it cost to walk away. People think survival is just leaving the bad place, but it's what comes after that tests you. The doubt, the guilt, the loneliness. And still, these women walked through it, chose themselves. I wasn't a celebrity. I wasn't even famous. But I was proof that healing is messy, nonlinear, and deeply personal, but also possible. And that mattered more than headlines, more than revenge. I didn't need the world to know. I just needed to keep going. There was one day I almost fell back into my old habits. An anniversary I didn't expect to remember crept up on me. The day we got married. I found myself staring at the gold necklace he'd given me that year. I almost wore it. Almost. But I didn't. Instead, I placed it in a donation box. Someone else could melt it down into something beautiful. That necklace wasn't me anymore. It was a relic of a life I buried. I sat with my journal and wrote instead, "I am not the woman he shaped. I am the woman I sculpted from the rubble." Then I went to the beach, barefoot in the sand, and let the ocean carry the grief out of me. There's something holy in that kind of release. Later that year, I bought my first home. Not a mansion, not a villa, just a 2-story fixer-upper with sunlight in every room. It smelled like paint and beginnings. I walked through the empty halls and touched the walls gently, whispering, "We're safe now." It may sound silly, but it felt alive to me, like the walls were listening. No raised voices, no icy silences, just music and dreams, and the smell of morning coffee. I hung my own art in the foyer and cried when I saw it under soft lighting. Mine. Everything here was mine, not given, not shared, not earned through endurance. I planted a rose bush in the yard, the same type he once told me was too much work. I smiled. Worthwhile things often are. Then came the day a major talk show host invited me to speak. I was terrified. My story was vulnerable, raw, but I said yes. Not for attention, but for that one woman watching at 2 a.m., thinking she's the only one. I spoke clearly, honestly, without sugarcoating. Love doesn't hurt. Betrayal does. And knowing the difference saved me. The host blinked back tears. After the show, I received hundreds of messages. Some thanked me. Some shared their pain. One woman said, "You gave me the words I couldn't find." That meant more than applause. I'd once been voiceless, shrinking in a marriage built on lies. Now, my voice shook rooms, not out of rage, but truth. And that truth, raw, unedited, was the bridge between who I was and who I'd become. At my next gallery showing, something strange happened. My ex's mother came. She stood quietly in front of a piece titled, "After the Fire," her fingers trembling. I approached her gently. "I didn't know you'd come." She looked at me, eyes glassy. "You were always too good for him," she whispered. And I was too blind to see it. That stunned me. For years, she defended him, blamed me, ignored the signs. Now, here she was, alone and remorseful. I didn't gloat. I didn't resent. I simply said, "We all see clearly when the smoke clears." She nodded, and we stood in silence before the painting. Some wounds don't need words, only acknowledgement. As she left, she turned back and said, "Thank you for surviving." I smiled. That's all I ever wanted. I later realized I hadn't just escaped a man, I'd escaped a version of myself. One who made herself smaller to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. One who thought quiet suffering was the cost of loyalty. That woman was gone. And in her place stood someone I genuinely liked. I laughed louder now. I danced in my kitchen. I bought fresh flowers for no reason. I took photos of my breakfast just because the sunlight hit it just right. Healing had turned ordinary moments into miracles. I didn't need a fairy tale ending. I already had mine. It was written not in grand gestures, but in soft mornings, hard choices, and the decision to keep loving myself, especially when it hurt. That was my revolution. Gentle, fierce, unapologetically mine. It was around this time I saw a headline online. His company had collapsed. Not from scandal or betrayal, but from rot. The kind that grows slowly when there's no integrity. I didn't cheer. I didn't feel pity either. It just was. The consequences of his choices, finally arriving. I wondered if he remembered that night in the hotel, when he offered me up like a trophy for a mistress to admire. I wondered if he ever regretted what he did to me. But I didn't need answers. Closure had never come from his mouth. It came from my own growth. His world crumbled. Mine bloomed. There was no revenge. Only distance. I didn't send flowers. I didn't even think of calling. That version of my life had ended. I was already pages ahead. One evening, I bumped into an old mutual friend, Alyssa. She'd been one of the few who knew the truth, but stayed silent. She smiled, awkward and too bright. "You look incredible," she said. I nodded politely. "Thanks." She paused, waiting for warmth. I didn't know her. I didn't know how to help back then. I tilted my head, studying her. "You didn't need to help. Just not adding weight would have been enough." She flinched, and for a second I saw her guilt. I didn't need her apology. I just needed her absence. We talked briefly, then parted ways. That moment solidified something. I no longer needed validation from those who once watched me drown. If you're not throwing a rope, at least don't throw stones. I finally understood that. Later, I started writing a book, not a memoir, but a fictionalized version of my journey. I gave my character the grace I once lacked. I let her make different mistakes, win sooner, smile earlier. It was cathartic, rewriting a life with justice. The words poured from me like rain after a drought. A publisher picked it up within months. At the launch party, I wore a scarlet dress, symbolic, and radiant. People clapped, cheered, cried. I stood there, remembering the girl who once begged a man to love her right. She felt like someone else entirely. The book wasn't a weapon. It was a mirror held up to every woman who doubted her worth. I didn't want revenge. I wanted reflection. And if one person saw themselves in those pages and chose differently, then I'd done enough. I received a letter from his mistress, Marlene, handwritten. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. I didn't know what he'd done to you, she wrote. I thought I was the exception, not the replacement. Her words trembled with shame. He left me too, just like that. She didn't ask for forgiveness, just understanding. I sat with it for a long time. I didn't hate her. I pitied her once. Now, I simply felt nothing. She was a part of a chapter one had no desire to reread. I didn't reply. Some silences are the most honest response. I burned the letter in the fireplace, not out of anger, but ceremony. One final ash falling into peace. Marlene may one day heal. That's her journey. Mine had already moved miles past her shadow. One day, while shopping for a lamp, I ran into someone unexpected, his father. The man who once called me too ambitious for a daughter-in-law. He looked smaller than I remembered, his arrogance replaced with a quiet unease. You're doing well, he said, more observation than compliment. Yes, I replied. Very. A pause lingered. Then he said something I never expected. I was wrong about you. I blinked. Yes, you were. And that was it. I walked away. No scolding, no dramatic monologue. Just truth. I didn't need him to grovel, just to acknowledge reality. The past didn't hold me hostage anymore. I'd outgrown every cage they tried to place me in. And the moment I turned my back on him, without a single ounce of hesitation, I knew I was finally free. I met someone months later, not in some cinematic moment, just at a bookstore, reaching for the same novel. His name was Isaac. Gentle eyes, quiet laugh, curious about the world in a way that made everything feel new. He didn't rush me, didn't question my silences. We had coffee, then another, then long walks and shared playlists. He didn't try to fix me, just listened. When I told him about my past, he didn't flinch. That must have been awful, he said. I'm glad you got out. No questions, no judgments, just space. I didn't know what we'd become, and I wasn't in a hurry, but it was nice to be seen, not weighed. Loved, not measured. I'd built a life where a man like Isaac was a bonus, not a lifeline. That made all the difference. Isaac once asked me what love meant to me now. I thought about it for a while. Freedom, I finally said. The freedom to be soft without fearing it'll be used against me. He nodded, like he understood completely. With him, I wasn't armor. I wasn't survival. I was joy and quiet evenings and inside jokes. It was unfamiliar, but beautiful. I used to think love had to be grand, overwhelming, full of fire. But this was like sunlight on skin, gentle, steady, sustaining. It didn't erase the past, but it rewrote the future. I stopped checking his phone. I stopped waiting for the shoe to drop. I stopped bracing for betrayal. That's when I knew I wasn't just healed. I was whole. And this time, I didn't lose myself in love. I found more of me. A year passed. My book became a quiet success, not a bestseller, but a beacon for women who'd been silenced. I received messages, long, tearful, thankful letters. You gave me words I didn't know I needed. One said, that mattered more than any award. One reader told me she left a toxic marriage after chapter 16. You reminded me I wasn't crazy, just mistreated. I cried reading that. If my pain had to happen, at least it became a torch for someone else's darkness. It was strange, knowing that what once broke me was now building someone else. But maybe that's healing, turning scars into roadmaps. My story wasn't for revenge anymore. It was for rebirth. And every time someone told me they'd risen too, it felt like I was rising all over again. Then one day, I got a message from him. Just one line. Can we talk? I stared at it for a long time, the way you might study a ghost. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, not with temptation, but clarity. He hadn't changed. Men like him don't evolve, they adapt to survive. I didn't block him. I didn't respond either. I let the silence answer for me. I owed him nothing, not my attention, not my rage, not even my indifference. I simply moved on. That was the power I'd earned. Not yelling, not gloating, just peace. He'd chosen his path, and I had walked mine. He would always be haunted by the woman I became, because she was everything he tried to prevent me from being. I saw a photo of him, months later. Alone, gaunt, sitting on a park bench, probably taken by some tabloid trying to mock his downfall. But I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance, like looking at an old uniform you'd outgrown. There was no hate, just gratitude that I escaped, that I didn't break completely, that I learned to build something new. I closed the article, took a sip of tea, and got back to editing my next book. This one wasn't about trauma. It was about rebirth, real and joyful, because I was done telling stories rooted in pain. I wanted to write about light too, because I'd finally stepped into mine. The past no longer followed me. It faded with every truth I told, every boundary I set. That was my real victory. One morning, my mother called, teary-voiced. "I just finished your book," she said. I didn't know. I should have seen it. I paused. We'd never talked about what happened. Not fully. "You weren't supposed to see it," I said gently. "You were supposed to love me through it." She cried harder. "I'm sorry I didn't." And that broke something open in me I didn't realize was still locked. Her apology came years late, but it mattered. We talked for hours. Not as mother and daughter, but woman to woman. She told me about her own silent wounds. How she'd been taught to endure, not escape. We healed together, thread by thread. Sometimes love comes late, but when it's real, it still counts. That conversation changed everything. It reminded me some relationships are worth reopening, gently. I started teaching writing workshops for women who wanted to tell their stories. Some were survivors. Others were seekers. All were powerful. Watching them shed shame on the page reminded me why I started writing in the first place. One woman, Ava, shared a piece about her fiancé controlling every dollar she spent. Her voice shook, but her words didn't. "I didn't even know it was abuse," she whispered. "I thought it was love." We hugged afterward. I told her, "You deserve softness that doesn't hurt." These workshops became sacred. No masks, no judgment, just truth. We didn't write to impress. We wrote to survive. And then to thrive. That space became more than a classroom. It became a haven, a reminder that our stories, even the broken ones, deserve to be heard and honored. At the last workshop of the season, one participant asked, "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" The room fell quiet. I thought about it carefully. I used to, I admitted. But now, no, because without that pain, I wouldn't have become this me. And I like her. That stunned silence turned into a round of soft nods. We weren't glorifying suffering. We were reclaiming it, turning it into art, into truth, into stepping stones. That night, I walked home under a quiet sky, the stars clear and kind. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd outgrown, the naive girl, the silenced wife, the shattered woman. And then I thought about the woman I'd become, not in spite of what happened, but because I chose to rise anyway. That's the story I'll keep telling. The final book launch event for my second novel was held in a small, independent bookstore that had become a haven for local writers. I stood at the podium, feeling the weight of everything that had led me here. My past, my growth, my lessons. As I spoke to the crowd, I could see familiar faces, old friends, colleagues, and even strangers who recognized the power of resilience. When the event was over, a woman came up to me. "You saved me," she whispered. "I left my husband because of your book. You made me realize I deserved more than just existing." I didn't know how to respond, except to hug her tightly. I'd never imagined my story would spark that kind of change in another person's life. The next morning, I sat on my apartment balcony, looking out at the city that had once felt like a cage. The air felt different now, lighter, as though the city itself had exhaled. I sipped my coffee slowly, feeling the warmth fill me. It wasn't just the coffee, it was the feeling of being fully in control of my life, of having earned every moment of peace I now enjoyed. I thought of all the days I spent crying, wondering if it would ever get better. And now, looking at the life I'd built, I realized it had always been within me to create it. I had to lose everything to find the courage to build something worthy of me. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend from college. He looked different, older, but still the same in a way. We sat at a cafe, catching up, talking about the twists life takes. He mentioned something I didn't expect. "I saw your ex recently," he said, casually. He looked rough. "I always thought you were the strong one in your relationship, but it seems like you were the one holding everything together." I smiled, not because I was vindicated, but because I finally realized the truth of what he'd said. He hadn't known what was happening behind closed doors. Neither had anyone else. But that didn't matter now. I had the strength to face life without anyone else's approval, and that was the freedom I'd earned. At a high-profile event later that year, my ex unexpectedly showed up. He was with someone new, as always. But this time he was different, his posture hunched, eyes looking everywhere but at me. I wasn't surprised. By now, I'd learned that his choices always left him hollow. He didn't see me as I walked past him. He couldn't. The woman he tried to break, the one who was supposed to stay small and unnoticed, she was no longer there. She had been replaced by someone who was unapologetically herself. I smiled inwardly. He didn't deserve my attention. Not anymore. I didn't need to confront him. The fact that he couldn't even bear to meet my eyes said everything I needed to know. I was done. The following week, I received a call from an old friend who had moved abroad. She told me she'd read about my success in a magazine, and that she was so proud of me. Then she asked, "Do you ever think about him?" It was a question I'd avoided for a long time, but now, looking at my reflection in the mirror, I had an answer. "I think about the lessons he taught me," I said, "but not him." She laughed softly. "That's the best answer." It was the first time in ages I could speak about him without the weight of anger or resentment. He had shaped me in ways I couldn't deny, but I was the one who decided what I would become after the storm. One evening, I was on my way home when I ran into someone who had once been close to both me and my ex. He looked nervous when he saw me. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry," he began, scratching his head. I didn't know what was going on, and I should have said something. I looked at him and realized that the apology wasn't for me. It was for him. He had watched my life spiral while feeling helpless, and now he wanted to make amends. But I didn't need his apology. I needed nothing from him. I smiled. "It's okay," I said. "I'm not the same woman anymore." And with that, I left. No bitterness, just peace. After the final draft of my book was completed, I found myself flipping through pages I hadn't looked at in months. I'd written it all. The pain, the growth, the healing. There was one part that hit me harder than I expected. The chapter about forgiveness. I wasn't writing it for him. I wasn't writing it for anyone except myself. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't something I had to give him. It was something I had to give me. I had spent so much time thinking about his wrongs, but the real work was in healing the parts of me he'd fractured. And as I turned the final page, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I was whole again. I was in the middle of a pitch meeting when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen quickly, my ex's name. It had been weeks since he'd tried to contact me, and for a moment, I almost felt the old pang of curiosity. But then I remembered who I was now. I wasn't the woman who waited for his calls anymore. I wasn't the woman who hung on to every word he said. I was the woman leading this meeting, making decisions that impacted my future. I looked away from my phone, refocusing on the task at hand. My team needed me. I had no time for distractions from someone who no longer had a place in my life. At home later that night, I sat on my balcony, looking at the city lights stretching out before me. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet that felt like the calm after a storm. The wind blew softly through my hair, and I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I'd accomplished. I had survived heartbreak. I had rebuilt my life, brick by brick, and I didn't need to look back. Every inch of success, every moment of peace, was proof that I was stronger than the pain I'd once lived with. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone, not even him. I had become the person I was always meant to be. The next week, I was interviewed by a national news outlet about my journey, how I had turned my pain into a powerful narrative that helped so many others. The interviewer asked, "What's the one thing you learned from your experience?" I smiled. I learned that I am enough, all on my own. I don't need anyone's validation to succeed. Not then, not now, not ever. It was a simple answer, but it carried weight. My ex had spent so long making me feel like I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't worthy of love. But in that moment, as I spoke those words into the microphone, I knew the truth. I was everything I'd ever needed. As my career continued to take off, I became a sought-after speaker at conferences and workshops. People from all over the world wanted to hear my story, to hear how I had turned the most painful chapter of my life into the beginning of something extraordinary. I stood in front of audiences, sharing not just the story of my betrayal, but the story of my rebirth. And every time I spoke, I could feel the energy in the room shift. People were inspired. They believed they, too, could rise from the ashes. And in those moments, I realized that my journey wasn't just mine, it was shared by so many others, waiting for their own moment to break free. One evening, after a particularly powerful talk, a woman approached me. She was trembling, tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "Your story gave me the strength to leave him. I thought I couldn't survive without him, but now I know I can." I took her hands in mine, squeezing them gently. "You're stronger than you think," I said. "You always were." She smiled through her tears, and I knew then that my pain had not been for nothing. It had created something beautiful, something that helped people heal. And in that, I found my greatest reward. Months later, my ex reached out again, this time through an email. It was a long message, full of apologies and regret. He admitted everything. How he'd used me, how he'd treated me like an option rather than a priority, how he'd never seen my worth until it was too late. He begged for a chance to make things right. I didn't even open it. The old me would have read every word, clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd change. But the new me, the woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up, she didn't need his apology. She didn't need his validation. I deleted the email without a second thought. The past was gone. It no longer held power over me. One Saturday morning, I decided to visit my old favorite park. It had been years since I'd walked through its paths, and as I did, memories came flooding back. I remembered the days when I'd walked through that park with him, thinking everything was perfect. How foolish I'd been, believing that love was something you could force to last. Now, as I strolled through the park alone, I realized that the park hadn't changed, but I had. The woman who had walked those paths in the past was not the woman who walked them now. I was someone new, someone who had learned to stand on her own, someone who had learned to trust herself above all else. I thought back to the time when I used to feel so lost without him, how I believed that life would crumble without his presence. But it didn't. In fact, life had only gotten better. I had built a life filled with purpose, passion, and joy. I had surrounded myself with people who valued me, people who saw me for who I truly was. And, most importantly, I had found the strength to trust myself again. The woman who had once been broken had become whole, stronger than she'd ever been. And as I walked through that park, I realized that I would never again settle for anything less than the life I deserved. A year passed, and everything continued to fall into place. My career reached new heights, my personal life flourished, and I found peace in the quiet moments I once thought would haunt me forever. One evening, while sitting at my desk, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering. It was him. His voice was shaky, like he was on the verge of tears. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I was wrong. I treated you like you were nothing, and now I realize you were everything." I listened, but I didn't feel the old pain. I felt nothing. I didn't want his apology anymore. I didn't need his closure. I had already closed that chapter in my life, and I was better for it. I didn't respond. I simply ended the call and went back to my work. Life had moved on, and so had I. The call didn't linger in my thoughts. I didn't replay it in my head, wondering if I'd made the right choice or what could have been. It was a stark contrast to how I would have reacted a year ago. Back then, I would have agonized over every word, doubting myself, questioning if I was too harsh. But now, there was nothing to question. I knew that everything I had done since leaving him was right. I had healed. I had grown. I had become a person I could be proud of. He had been a chapter in my life, but he was no longer my story. As I continued to climb in my career, the offers started to come in. High-profile clients, collaborations with top brands, things that once seemed out of reach, things I'd only dreamed about when I was still with him. But now, they were my reality. I no longer had to beg for attention or fight for recognition. I had earned my place in the world, and for the first time in my life, I understood the true meaning of self-worth. It wasn't about being chosen by someone else. It was about choosing yourself, over and over again, no matter what anyone else thought or did. One day, as I stood at the opening of my new office, something I had built from the ground up, with my own hands, a reporter asked me how it felt to have come this far. I smiled. "It feels exactly like I always knew it would," I said. "It feels like home." I had found my place in the world, and it wasn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about living my truth. It was about thriving in my own skin. And as I looked out over the crowd of well-wishers, I knew that every sacrifice, every moment of pain, had led me to this very moment. A few months later, I received an invitation to a charity gala. I knew he would be there. He always attended events like this, trying to maintain his image as the perfect businessman. I considered not going, but I realized something. I didn't have to avoid him. I didn't need to hide from my past. I was proud of who I had become. So I attended. As soon as I walked into the venue, I felt his eyes on me. He was with his new girlfriend, but I didn't care. His gaze lingered for a moment longer than I expected, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel anything. Not anger, not regret, not sadness, just indifference. I had moved on, and he could see it. He approached me later in the evening, his face full of regret. "I made a mistake," he said. "I should have never let you go. I was a fool." I looked at him, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. But that was the old me. The new me didn't waste energy on someone who had never truly valued her. "I'm glad you finally realized," I said, my voice calm and steady. "But it doesn't change anything. I've already moved on." He stood there, speechless, as I walked away. There was no need for me to say more. My life was no longer tethered to his, and I was free. The next day, a news outlet reached out to me for an interview. They wanted to know about my journey, how I had turned betrayal into triumph. I agreed, but I made one thing clear from the start. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about resilience, about finding strength in yourself, even when others try to tear you down. The interview went viral, and soon my story was being shared everywhere. I became a symbol of empowerment, a living testament to the fact that you could rise from the ashes of your past and create a future beyond your wildest dreams. As I stood in front of my mirror that evening, I took a moment to reflect. The woman who once cried herself to sleep, the woman who believed she would never be enough, was gone. In her place stood someone unshakable, someone who had weathered the storm and emerged stronger than ever. I had rebuilt myself, piece by piece. And now I was unrecognizable, not just to the world, but to the version of myself I had left behind. In the years that followed, I continued to grow. I became a mentor to others, helping them find their own paths to healing. I spoke at conferences, sharing my story with anyone who would listen, reminding them that they, too, had the power to rebuild their lives. I had become a beacon of hope, not because of what I had lost, but because of what I had gained. I had gained myself. I had gained freedom. As for him, I heard snippets about his life every now and then. His business collapsed. His relationships were messy, and it seemed like he was constantly chasing the validation of others. But I didn't care. I didn't need to know his story anymore. I had my own story to write. A story of a woman who had learned that her worth was never tied to anyone else's approval. A story of a woman who had finally come into her own, and who would never settle for anything less than the life she deserved. And that, in the end, was the greatest triumph of all. I had taken everything he once feared losing, and I had turned it into the life of my dreams. A life where I was whole, independent, and unapologetically myself. A life where I no longer needed anyone's approval to be happy. I was the author of my own destiny now, and my story was just beginning.